The views expressed on Science for the People are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
This week on Science for the People, we're talking about psychedelics, their history, their effects, some of the new research that's being done, and some of their potential clinical uses. Welcome to Science for the People. I'm Rochelle Saunders. Brad Burge is the Director of Communications and Marketing for the nonprofit MAPS, which stands for Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. He earned his BA in Communication and Psychology from Stanford University in 2005 and his MA in Communication from the University of California, San Diego in 2009. Brad is also a consultant, writer, and editor for organizations and individuals working in psychedelic and medical marijuana research, drug policy, and psychedelic therapy. Brad, welcome to Science for the People.
Thanks, Rochelle. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, so before we really dive into what's going on now, I do want to give people a little bit of context. So can you talk a little bit about the history of psychedelics and research? In the 50s and 60s, it seems like there was a lot of active research, and then all that seems to have ended in the 70s. What happened?
Yeah, we talk a lot about, or we hear a lot about the restoration of psychedelics to mainstream science and medicine. And it really is a restoration. I was reading a book recently, a really phenomenal book called Acid Test, LSD, Ecstasy, and the Power to Heal by Tom Schroeder, who's a well-known award-winning journalist, wrote an excellent book, addressed a lot of this history of psychedelic research and how MAPS and MAPS founder Rick Doblin, my boss, has been working for about 30 years, 29 years actually, to get psychedelics back to an accepted place in science and medicine, where they're being looked at from a real, rational, careful scientific angle rather than being ignored from a place of stigma. And in this book, Acid Test, one of the researchers who's been involved in the science for a long time, since before psychedelics were criminalized, said that in the 1970s, when the war on drugs really started to pick up steam, it was as if psychedelics had been, quote, undiscovered. There was an undiscovery of psychedelics that happened. And that means that there were actually a lot of people, as you alluded to, using psychedelics in therapy, doing initial research, looking at the various uses of MDMA, LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, DMT. A whole range of research was being done into psychedelics in the 1950s and 1960s, and even into the 1970s. A lot of that work that was being done was therapeutic use. So there was a group of psychotherapists and other kinds of therapists in California, in other parts of the world, who were using psychedelics in their practice to help people with post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, with anxiety. MDMA, also what's now known on the street anyway as ecstasy or Molly, was being used fairly widely in couples counseling. So a lot of work was already happening with these drugs, including Stanislav Grof, who is a psychiatrist, a Czech psychiatrist, has been working in the field since the 1960s, actually administered thousands of LSD sessions to his patients up until the 1970s when the drugs were criminalized. So a lot of that information is still available. In fact, it's all still available. It's available on the MAPS website, and you can access that information. But it wasn't double-blind, placebo-controlled research that was happening at that time. So there was a lot of excitement about the potential of psychedelics use in science and therapy for understanding how the mind works, for helping people uncover some of their deeper traumas. But it wasn't FDA-approved, double-blind, placebo-controlled research like what we're doing now. So with that undiscovery of psychedelics and the intervening 40 years or so, maybe 25, 30 years before the research got started again, there really wasn't much advancement in the field. So what we're now seeing is a resurgence of interest from mainstream universities, legitimate researchers, and a few small funders who are starting to get interested in seeing some of these psychedelics return to a place in mainstream science and medicine.
So why was research in psychedelics effectively shut down?
Well, as we all know, psychedelics are illegal now. They were put into Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which was the sort of keystone of the war on drugs, which made a certain class of drugs illegal. Now, what many people misunderstand is that Schedule 1 drugs, even though they are illegal, the research into those Schedule 1 drugs was never actually illegal and is still, in fact, technically legal. So medical research, scientific research, neuroscientific research looking at Schedule 1 drugs, including marijuana, LSD, MDMA, that's all technically legal. The problem was that once the drugs were stigmatized, once they were listed and became well known as drugs of abuse, rather than drugs that had potential beneficial uses in certain situations, funding evaporated overnight, and mainstream government support, major universities, prominent researchers no longer wanted to touch psychedelics with a 10-foot pole for fear of being labeled hippies or political radicals or accused of abusing the drugs. So it was really the stigma, the cultural aspect of the war on drugs that prevented the research from moving forward at that time.
Okay, just so everybody has an understanding of what it is we're talking about here, can you walk us through a little bit about how psychedelics work? I mean, what do they actually do to us biologically?
Well, psychedelics are, that's a great question. Psychedelics are really, they're a broad class, and the word psychedelic is not a clinical term, which is to say that the word psychedelic doesn't describe a particular mechanism of action. It doesn't describe what's happening in the brain. So if we're talking about LSD, we're getting very different pharmacological effects, very different psychological effects than we get with MDMA or with psilocybin or with these other compounds. So rather, when we mention the word psychedelic, when we use the word psychedelic, we're referring to the general psychological effect that they're having. Their potential to help people get to some of the deeper emotions or deeper experiences that they're having. Technically, the word psychedelic, which was coined in the 1950s, means mind manifesting, or a compound that brings to light the previously hidden contents of the mind. So in the context of psychotherapy, that can be very valuable, and that's why we're so excited about psychedelics in therapy. It's because often the challenge of psychotherapy is that patients don't want to talk about the more difficult emotions that they're having, or they're locked into a particular concept of who they are in their relationships or who they are as a person and what they're capable of. But psychedelics, through all of their various mechanisms, or many of their mechanisms, seem to destabilize that concept of self that people have, especially when used in therapeutic settings, and people are predisposed to thinking about them in that way. So in therapy, these capacities of psychedelics to destabilize the ego, to get people into a deeper touch with their deeper emotions, and in the case of MDMA, to help people feel more comfortable and safer talking about their difficult experiences with their therapist. That's why we're looking so carefully at the use of psychedelics when combined with psychotherapy.
So when we hear the term Schedule 1 narcotic, we just assume that there's an addictive quality there. Are psychedelics addictive?
From what we've seen, by and large, they're not. In fact, the scheduling process, and this is part of the stigma, is that there's when the drugs were scheduled, there was no evidence, there was no scientific evidence suggesting that they were addictive. They simply got lumped into the same category as heroin, cocaine, other drugs which are commonly abused. Nicotine is a legal drug, which is highly addictive. Alcohol, also a legal drug, which is highly addictive. The scheduling of a drug doesn't necessarily have much to do with its actual addictive potential. MDMA, LSD, psilocybin, the active component in magic mushrooms, from what we've seen in all the research that's been done in human subjects, we haven't seen any sort of long-term addictive potential in those substances. In fact, some of those substances are actually being explored for their capacity to help people get off of other drugs, which do have more addictive potentials. So unfortunately, a lot of the stigma and miseducation, some of the bad science that has come out in the last 30, 40 years of the war on drugs has led us to believe on a cultural level that these drugs are addictive, when in fact it's all about how you use them.
Okay, so you mentioned possible clinical applications, so I'm just going to keep us going in that direction. There have been a lot of potential clinical applications of psychedelics being discussed. Can you talk about what some of the potential uses may be?
Sure. Well, I'll start with what is MAPS's main focus right now, and in fact, what prompted the founding of MAPS in 1986, which was the criminalization of MDMA. Which is short for methylene dioxymethamphetamine. It's related to amphetamine or speed, but it's a different chemical. It has a different chemical structure on it, which makes it different. Amphetamine, straight amphetamine, is highly addictive and very dangerous. MDMA, on the other hand, is different and doesn't have the same addictive potential, doesn't have the same cardiac and neurological effects that straight amphetamine does. So just to make that distinction, MDMA has now become popular on the street as ecstasy or Molly. What's important to note there is that what people buy illegally on the criminal black market, more often than not, doesn't actually contain any MDMA at all. More than 50% of the ecstasy and Molly that is analyzed, that's purchased illegally and manufactured illegally, doesn't contain this pure active compound of MDMA. And it's that pure active compound that we're looking at in therapy. MDMA, as I mentioned, was first used in couples counseling and post-traumatic stress disorder in the 1970s up until 1985 when it was criminalized. Right now, our main focus, most of our resources, MAPS is a nonprofit. We get all of our funding from individuals or small private family foundations. So far, government funders and large pharmaceutical funders, pharmaceutical companies, for example, have not been interested in funding the research. I think we're getting more and more to that point now that we're kind of starting to overcome the stigma and some initial research is starting to come out. But most of our limited resources as a nonprofit are going to researching MDMA combined with psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. We've had some really exciting results in our first two studies, small pilot studies that we've completed in the last several years. The most exciting one was a paper that was published in 2011 in the Journal of Psychopharmacology that showed that 83%, that's 83% of the subjects who received just 2 sessions of MDMA combined with psychotherapy no longer qualified for PTSD after those 2 sessions. And these weren't people with just light PTSD or had just gotten it. These were all subjects who had tried medications, they'd tried psychotherapy, other forms of psychotherapy for their PTSD, and they hadn't been helped by it. In fact, the people in that study had suffered from PTSD for an average of 19 years. And we saw that after just 2 sessions of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, they didn't have PTSD anymore. That 83% is to be compared with 25% in the placebo group. So 25% of those in the study who received psychotherapy but not MDMA, they recovered from PTSD. So the difference there is 83% versus 25%. 83%, by the way, is a tremendous result. That's far beyond the effectiveness of currently approved treatments for PTSD, which are both SSRIs or antidepressants.
You mentioned placebo, and I gotta ask, how does one test a psychedelic against a placebo?
It's actually very hard.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah, if you're a trained therapist or you're familiar with the effects of psychedelics, you can usually tell that you've gotten the placebo versus the real thing. And the way that we address that is by doing what's called a dose response study. So at the low end, or the quote unquote placebo group, we give them a very, very small dose of MDMA. So a dose that is really around 25 or 30 milligrams, as opposed to the full dose, which is around 125 milligrams. So the idea there is that we get some small effect, but at least the hypothesis goes, not enough of an effect to actually influence the therapy. And we're seeing really good results on that range. So people who receive very, very low doses, they confuse the therapists enough into thinking that they got the full dose, but they don't have the same massive benefits that they sometimes see with the full dose.
So these results, these numbers are a little bit unbelievable when you hear them. I mean, what has the reaction been both within the academic community and outside it? What has the reaction been to this study?
Well, within the scientific community, it's been really excellent. Just a couple of weeks ago, we learned that paper that I just mentioned had received a prize from Sage Publications in the Journal of Psychopharmacology for being the highest cited paper in the journal in 2011. So scientists who are doing other kinds of research are drawing on that research substantially and using it as a way to move the other research that they're doing forward. So within the scientific community, it's been really, really strong and outstanding. In fact, we're seeing a wide international field growing fairly quickly of younger researchers and even older researchers who are seeking new projects, getting involved in psychedelic research because the stigma is decreasing, largely as a result of some of these initial results that we're seeing. That's within the scientific community. Within the therapeutic community, I had the opportunity to go to Toronto, Canada, for the American Psychiatric Association conference just this year, a few months ago. It was my first time in Canada. It was our first. It was the first time MAPS had ever had a table about psychedelic research in the exhibit hall of a major psychiatric conference like that. And we were not sure what kind of response we would get. We know that psychedelics have a bad rap, and we thought we might be ridiculed, or people would ask really difficult questions, or they'd be really, really skeptical. But in fact, by and large, the therapeutic community, especially the therapeutic community who treats PTSD and is involved with PTSD patients, they're very excited about this research. And more often than not, the question isn't, why are you here? Aren't these drugs dangerous? But the question is, can I prescribe it now? Is it available now? Can I give this to my patients now? And we have to say, no, it's not legal yet. We're still doing the research, but please talk to your colleagues about it and support us however you can. So within the therapeutic community, there's such a crushing need to find a better approach to dealing with the PTSD epidemic that people are very open and they're very excited. Both younger researchers and therapists and older people. There's even a particular group of older therapists, psychiatrists in their 60s and 70s who were practicing in the field before LSD and MDMA and other psychedelics were criminalized, and who saw at that time psychedelics as being the next great thing in psychiatry. But because of the war on drugs and the stigma and the risk of their professional reputation being lost, they've had to move away from those treatments, and they haven't been able to administer those treatments because they've been illegal. So some of the older therapists, older psychiatrists, physicians are very excited also to see this work coming back into the mainstream. So that's within professional communities. The media response has also been phenomenal. The headlines have slowly been shifting to be more and more responsible. And what I mean by that is the headlines used to be sort of, used to kind of exaggerate the risks or, equate MDMA and ecstasy. Like I said, ecstasy is very rarely actually pure MDMA, and they would say ecstasy cures trauma, which is not true. But rather MDMA combined with therapy can help people come to a better relationship with their trauma and eliminate their symptoms. So I think the media, editors, journalists, television, documentary filmmakers are starting to catch on a little bit and starting to help with the public education around these drugs.
So this study was done in 2011. Has there been any follow-up with the people who participated in this to see what the staying power of this was? Yeah.
Psychedelics are often seen as something that might maybe produce a change right now in the here and now, that the changes that we see in people following MDMA-assisted psychotherapy is going to be very limited, or it's not going to last. We actually followed those subjects who were primarily female survivors of sexual assault and abuse, and followed them for an average of 3.8 years. After their second MDMA-assisted psychotherapy session. And on average, those results were sustained. We actually published a follow-up paper in the same journal in 2013 about those long-term follow-ups that acknowledged those results. So clearly it wasn't just a temporary afterglow that people were experiencing, but rather long-term improvements, or what clinicians call durable remission, the remission of symptoms, the reduction of symptoms that lasts a long time following therapy.
So a lot of the studies I've read that are coming out about psychedelics all have really small sample sizes, often just 10, 20, maybe 30 people. Are there any larger trials being done anywhere or started to get organized?
Well, we're starting to get them organized. Exactly. The FDA drug development process goes in phases. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then sometimes phase 4. Phase 3 are the large studies that you're talking about with hundreds of subjects. Those are the studies that the FDA needs to evaluate in order to decide whether a drug or a device should be approved for marketing in the US. The two studies that we've completed, the one in 19 subjects with those that 83% result that I mentioned, that was in Charleston, South Carolina. Our other completed study, that was in 12 subjects, that was in Switzerland. So 19 subjects and 12 subjects. Those are very, very small studies. We also have 4 ongoing additional phase 2 studies, one also in South Carolina, one in Boulder, Colorado, one in Vancouver, Canada, and then one in Israel. All of those are less than 24 subjects, so 24 subjects or less. In fact, the Israel study is going to be up to 10 subjects, and the Canadian study also about 10 subjects, Boulder about 23. And our current study, which is just about to end in South Carolina, which is primarily in veterans, that's 24 subjects. So these are small studies. The purpose of these phase 2 studies is to help us design the best possible phase 3 studies that we can, so we don't waste our investment in those, so that we can make sure that the results are strongest. We're getting statistically significant results. Our clinical effect sizes are large enough. We know what dose to use to obtain those results. And then what kinds of people do we need to enroll? For whom does this therapy not work? Because there are groups of people with certain mental conditions or certain histories, or physiological conditions that make them not fit for this kind of therapy. So the phase 3 studies will be starting next year. And those studies are designed in a collaborative way. So MAPS and the Food and Drug Administration will actually meet and say, okay, how can we best design these studies so that we can advance this treatment as best as possible, so that we can get the best possible results and do the best possible science. And like I mentioned, we're a nonprofit, so the phase 3 studies, those are going to have to be entirely funded from donations, as far as we know, unless some major funder comes in, maybe listens to Science for the People and says, hey, I want to make this happen. Then we're going to have to find that funding from somewhere. And we're looking at approximately $22 million as the cost of those phase 3 studies, of which we've already raised about $5 million. So it's eminently possible that we're able to raise the funds for this. And in fact, $22 million is really just chump change if you're looking at what the for-profit pharmaceutical company industry tends to spend on pharmaceutical drug development. They tend to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to develop compounds, which they then bring to market. In this case, $22 million for phase 3 is pretty low.
So when we talk about psychedelics being effective or successful, what are we measuring against? Are we measuring against doing nothing? Are we measuring against the existing treatments? What's our benchmark?
Well, for the FDA to approve something, it has to represent what they believe, what their reviewers judge to be a significant improvement over existing treatments. So if somebody comes up with a treatment that works about the same or slightly less than existing treatments, then they won't approve it, because there's no reason to have another drug or device out there. So in this case, it's going to be measured against existing treatments. And those are what I already mentioned, SSRIs, Prozac and Paxil, which are the two currently approved medication-based treatments for PTSD. And if the results are sustained, if we keep seeing the kinds of results that we've already seen in our first two completed pilot studies and the preliminary results that we're seeing in these phase 2 studies, that should be no problem at all.
So the studies that you've talked about so far have been primarily about PTSD, but PTSD is not the only place where we're talking about psychedelics having a clinical use. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the other areas that people are researching actively right now?
Sure. Yeah. There's quite a bit more. We see MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD research as the wedge that is going to, in a sense, open up opportunities for additional uses of psychedelics in therapy, and also down the road for spirituality and for creativity and for personal growth for people who are otherwise healthy. We ultimately want to see there being safe and legal contexts where people can use psychedelics for any beneficial purpose. But first, the science has to be done, and the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD research is hopefully what's going to help open that up, both politically and culturally, as well as financially, since once MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD is approved, then MAPS will be able to legally market and sell MDMA for prescription for use in clinics in inpatient settings, and that's going to give us an income stream which we can then use to fund other research. So the other research that we're looking at currently, we're also looking at two other conditions using MDMA combined with therapy. One is for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for people with anxiety associated with life-threatening illness. So people with cancer, leukemia, or other life-threatening illnesses that are either currently active or in remission, and then using MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to help people be more comfortable with their life, more comfortable with their illness, and ultimately be more comfortable with death. That's a really exciting indication from my perspective, I believe, because unlike PTSD, which a lot of people do suffer from, anxiety about death is something that we can all at least identify with. So that's an exciting indication. We have another study also looking at MDMA combined with therapy for social anxiety in adults who are on the autism spectrum. That's an ongoing study in LA. We're working with some researchers in collaboration with the Los Angeles Biomedical Research Institute, or LA Biomed. We're also working with some researchers at Stanford who are doing blood analysis in that study. And that's using MDMA to combine with therapy to help autistic adults feel more comfortable in social situations. There, we're not trying to treat or cure autism, but rather to help autistic people develop social skills, feel more comfortable communicating their emotions, and so on. So that's the MDMA research that we're working on now. We've also completed a study using LSD in psychotherapy, otherwise known as LSD-assisted psychotherapy, and that's also to treat anxiety in people with life-threatening illness. That study was completed in 2012. That was completed in Switzerland. Very, very small study in just 12 subjects. But we did find in that study clinically significant reductions in anxiety, which means that everybody who participated in the study did see some benefit and didn't experience any harm. Although the study was so small with just 12 subjects, the statistical significance wasn't as strong as we would have liked. Although if we'd gotten the same effects that we got in that study, in a study with more people, it would have been very, very strong effects. This statistics is pretty important to understand there. We don't have any other LSD research happening right now because we're so focused on the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, but we are conducting observational studies, which means we're not actually administering the drug to people, but rather following them through treatment of ibogaine-assisted therapy and ayahuasca-assisted therapy. Both the ibogaine and the ayahuasca-assisted therapy studies, that's looking at how those drugs can be used in combination with therapy, also in combination with certain kinds of ceremonies or mindfulness-based meditation practices or certain forms of body work to help people reduce their reliance on other drugs. So here we're using ibogaine-assisted therapy and ayahuasca-assisted therapy as addiction interrupters to help people recover from either opiate abuse, alcohol abuse, cocaine abuse, and other patterns of dependence. So those are observational studies. The ayahuasca study that has recently been published, that was conducted in British Columbia in collaboration with a First Nations band. And the Ibogaine study, that's actually 2 studies that were conducted in Mexico and New Zealand.
You mentioned possible negative side effects of psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted therapy. What are the potential negative side effects, and how dangerous is this?
Yes, there's side effects to everything, especially drugs, and they vary depending on the drug. So one thing that can happen, for example, with MDMA is during the course of therapy, people can feel acute anxiety. They can feel fear. They can feel sort of a deeper connection with difficult memories or difficult experiences that they've had, and that can produce anxiety right there. In the context of therapy, that's not so much a problem, although it is technically a side effect. Because often you expect that anxiety will come up as you're processing difficult emotions. Also with MDMA, we've also seen slightly elevated heart rates, slightly elevated blood pressure with MDMA. That hasn't been a problem in over 1,000 administrations of MDMA, pure MDMA in clinical trials. That is, human beings in research receiving pure MDMA haven't had any significant negative effects happening as a result of their MDMA use. And of course, that flies in the face of all of the media coverage that we see of people overdosing and getting too hot and overheated and dehydrated when using ecstasy or Molly, what they think is MDMA, in uncontrolled, unsafe environments. We've seen that most of the harm and potential danger that's coming from these drugs actually comes from the war on drugs itself and the absence of resources for people to be safe. In the context of therapy, the side effects or the negative effects of these drugs seems to be fairly minimal. We haven't seen any evidence, and we have measured it, looking at the subjects in all of these studies. We haven't seen any evidence of cognitive damage or long-term addiction or anything like that. So compared to currently available pharmaceuticals, the side effects of psychedelics seem to be quite minimal.
So there are a lot of places where psychedelics are being talked about in a really enthusiastic way. And you mentioned before they're getting a lot of good press. And in some cases, the media is reporting more responsibly about them. But there are places where it seems a little bit like psychedelics are being seen as this kind of cure-all for mental health problems. And I just wonder, does that worry you at all a little bit? Because oftentimes when that happens, there isn't a lot of stock there there's not a lot holding that up.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, they're definitely not a cure-all, and they're definitely not for everybody. We exclude people with certain mental conditions, as I mentioned, certain physiological conditions from our studies. So that's one of the benefits of using psychedelics in therapy versus just purchasing some drug off the street and using it in an unsafe environment, is that the subjects are actually screened. And if you have a heart problem or a neurological problem that's going to make the administration of, say, MDMA or LSD riskier, then you're not admitted into the study. So I think part of what we can do to counteract some of these overblown claims about psychedelics being able to cure everything, which they can't, is to really pump up the public education aspect and really educate people honestly about, well, which conditions are these best for, who should probably avoid them, and so on. The rhetoric of psychedelics being a cure-all or that psychedelics can save the world, that doesn't worry us so much because it's been happening since the 1960s. It's been a regular thing, and there have been very, very vocal proponents of psychedelics for 40 or 50 years in the U.S. and Europe. And so what we're doing sure, we're making a lot of noise about psychedelics in therapy and their beneficial uses, but we're doing it in a way that acknowledges their risks and in a way that very carefully frames, well, this is for use in therapy, and there's safer ways and there's less safe ways to use them. I think where a lot of the rhetoric gets out of control and even dangerous is when people think, oh, this drug is going to cure me, or I can just pop a pill, pop some MDMA and expect my PTSD to be cured. Which is not at all what we're seeing in the research, which is not at all what we believe to be happening. So I think the public education, the honest education that we're doing in the media right now is a major way to reduce some of the harms that are potentially associated with people using these drugs outside of clinical contexts.
There is also a whole contingent of psychedelics cheerleading that has a tendency to sound a little kind of new agey, a little mystical, a little spiritual. And there's definitely a contingent of people who will roll their eyes at that sort of thing and just kind of look the other way. Do you feel like that kind of cheerleader might hurt some of the credibility of what you guys are trying to do, or what the research is showing, or what the science is that you guys are trying to work on?
Well, I think part of what psychedelic therapy research, psychedelic science shows is that spirituality and healing from mental illness are actually quite intertwined. That people often have spiritual experiences in the context of psychedelic therapy. And there is an association between the benefits that people get out of psychedelic therapy and the extent to which they see those sessions as mystical or spiritual. So I think, talking about spirituality isn't necessarily a bad thing in the context of science. If we look at it as kind of two sides of a cultural battle. We have science on one side and spirituality on the other. I think psychedelic science can help to bridge some of those two divides. There are people, again, who are very enthusiastic in the psychedelic cheerleading, which I think is a great term. It definitely happens. But I think as long as people's experiences are carefully framed and people are careful to say, hey, this is my experience, and this might not be somebody else's interpretation of the experience, then I think we can continue communicating what the therapies are doing in an honest way.
So you talked about the overwhelmingly positive reaction that you guys have had so far to the research that's being done. But has there been any significant criticism or pushback, both within or the medical and research communities or outside them, to some of this latest psychedelics research?
Yeah, really interestingly, we haven't seen a lot of that resistance. After 40 years of counter propaganda and bad science about psychedelics, you might expect that there's going to be a lot of people resisting it or coming out publicly against it. But I think the science is really speaking for itself. Some of the research that we've shown, the widespread interest, the support from major research institutions like NYU and Johns Hopkins, it's shifting the conversation to where nobody's really coming out vocally against it. I think that's for a lot of reasons. I think the stigma is eroding. There's overall declining faith in the war on drugs. We're seeing the prisons fill up. We're seeing the progressive legalization of medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. So the war on drugs as a solution to our planet's drug problems is, I think, increasingly falling into disregard. And so people are less likely to just throw psychedelics and other drugs out the window for their history. Also, declining faith in the major pharmaceutical industry. Clearly, for-profit pharmaceutical companies are designing drugs for their profitability and not necessarily for their ability to heal people. We're learning a lot about the long-term negative side effects of prescription pharmaceuticals, antidepressants in particular. And so people are looking, patients and therapists, scientists are looking for alternatives. They're looking for a new way of approaching and understanding and treating mental illness. And psychedelics and cannabis even can maybe able to help fill some of that void.
Has any of the psychedelics research that's been done so far been tested against some of the existing treatments like antidepressants?
There haven't been any direct comparisons yet. In terms of let's give this group psychedelics and then give this group the conventional one. Although we could totally see that happening in the future. For now, the FDA just needs to see that psychedelic assisted therapy, whichever happens to be being explored, is both safe and effective for a particular condition. But those direct comparisons haven't happened yet. For now, all we can look at is the research that's been done to get those drugs approved and then compare it to the research that we're now seeing. And as I mentioned, the comparison is pretty stark, where you get very small effects even in large studies with SSRIs. And even then, 1 out of 3 people don't respond to them. Then you compare that to the 83% success rate we saw in that small initial pilot study. It's a pretty stark comparison.
So attitudes towards psychedelics are changing. But what are the major hurdles for you guys right now when you want to do research into psychedelics? Is it mostly just money at this point? Are there still a lot of regulation hoops? Has there been a lot of pushback politically that's causing you guys headaches? Like what's the big hurdle?
Well, in order to get the level of funding that we need for phase 3, again, about $22 million, we believe that we need some larger major foundation or government support. So funding is really the major hurdle there. It's no longer very difficult to actually initiate the research in terms of getting approval from the FDA, from the ethics committee, and even from the DEA. It's fairly straightforward now to get these protocols approved. Part of that is because those regulators are no longer so biased, or no longer so afraid of approving the studies, and many of them actually want to see what the research says, so they're eager to approve it. And part of that is just because the researchers such as MAPS, Hefter Research Institute, and other organizations who are working on psychedelic therapy research, we've just gotten better at doing the protocols, gotten better at science, and knowing what the FDA and the other regulators are looking for. So actually getting the approvals is no longer that difficult, at least in terms of psychedelics. For whole plant medical marijuana research, which could make marijuana a federally legal prescription drug covered by insurance that doctors can prescribe, that's been actually much harder than the psychedelic research.
Oh, interesting.
For some reason, the marijuana is a linchpin of the war on drugs, and it is harder to break down that barrier than it is to break down barriers to psychedelic science. So it's primarily a funding issue, but funding and politics are always intertwined. And when we go to large funders or government officials, military officials who might support MDMA-assisted psychotherapy as a treatment for veterans or active duty military personnel with PTSD, by and large, the individuals support our work, and they want to see people with PTSD have more options. But then they say, well, I'm not so sure what my commanding officer or what my boss will say, or I'm not sure what the media will say, or, there seems to be sort of a generalized fear, especially if you're a major public figure or you have a lot invested in the status quo, or you're a politician or a military official or what have you. There seems to be a fear that their reputation might be on the line if they were to support psychedelic research, and they see it as a risk that they're taking to get on board. When in fact, how we see it, and how we try to present this to people is, if psychedelic therapy does in fact represent a transformation in how we're approaching and treating mental illness, then wouldn't you want to be one of the first ones to get on board? Then you can say, look, I'm one of the first ones to support this, and we can start seeing it as a reputational opportunity rather than a reputational risk. I'm thinking especially of Dr. Sanjay Gupta on CNN, who just made huge waves last year when he acknowledged that he had been, quote, wrong on medical marijuana. And he sent out a big public letter saying, I've said all these negative things about marijuana, but, now I learned that kids with seizures are being cured cured by using these non-psychoactive forms of marijuana, and there's all these different uses for it. So, I'm sorry, and now I really want to do what I can to promote medical marijuana research. So now Sanjay Gupta has come ahead as one of the leading proponents of medical marijuana, which is absolutely going to happen nationwide in the U.S. Sooner or later, it now appears. So that's just one example of how a major public figure, especially the kinds of people who could fund our research, even just in a single go. $22 million is lunch money for a lot of these billionaire philanthropists who want to see major cultural and social change happen. For them to see psychedelic therapy and science as an opportunity rather than a risk, I think that will be the major hurdle going forward.
You mentioned before that it seems like marijuana is the linchpin that's holding the finger in the dam, essentially, for some of this stuff. Why is that? What is it about marijuana that's so polarizing, or that people have really kind of grabbed onto to fight about? Because it's, by any stretch, it's really one of the most sort of non-dangerous, kind of chill things to fight about.
Yeah. As far as its psychological effects, it's much less potent than psychedelics. It's a shorter experience, and more people use it. And that may be the key, is that marijuana is widely used across the world, and has been for millennia. It was really the reefer madness campaigns of the 1930s that got the war on drugs started. It was using marijuana as a way to prosecute and criminalize ethnic minorities and political radicals, and people that the status quo didn't want to have around. So it was a way to lock people up and to criminalize them and to push them aside outside of contemporary society. So marijuana has been part of the war on drugs for 80, 90 years now. And for that reason is just so entrenched in our public imagination as the devil weed or the demon weed. And, the whole reefer madness thing, it still sticks around. So there's that cultural aspect. There's also an economic aspect to it, is that so many people use marijuana. It's a really easy thing to use if you want to lock up a certain section of the population in prison. So if you're making money by locking people up in prisons, which people do, something on the order of $35,000 or $40,000 a year for people in prison, like that's how much the private prison industry gets as income for having somebody in prison. So there's an economic incentive to put people in jail. Also, there's the criminal international cartel aspect, is that marijuana is the primary funder for most cartels, for most criminal cartels. And without that income from marijuana sales, you have a much weaker cartel organization. So the continued criminalization of marijuana also holds up this entire militarized criminal system that we have at the Mexico-U.S. border and elsewhere. So I think there's all these ways that marijuana is kind of holding up the war on drugs. And once we see its legalization, like we've seen in Colorado, and the positive effects that can have economically, socially, culturally, medically, I think the rest of the war on drugs, the rest of the prohibition attitude is going to slowly or hopefully quickly collapse.
Okay, so MAPS recently did a harm reduction program at Burning Man, which I want to talk to you about. So can you tell us a little bit about that, what Burning Man is for those who might not know, and why harm reduction is needed, just what the program was and how it went? To
connect it to our previous conversation, the harm reduction work that we're doing is part of this unstigmatization of psychedelics that we're doing, and trying to create a vision, an example of a society in which we don't need to lock people up for using drugs, that we can provide peer-to-peer, community-based counseling and safety education about drugs, so that people don't need to be thrown in jail or hospitalized for what they choose to put into their bodies. So harm reduction is just that. It's reducing the harms that are associated with using these drugs. We acknowledge that even though we're exploring psychedelics and marijuana for their therapeutic uses, that people will continue to use them recreationally. They'll continue to use them on their own. They'll continue to go to parties, events, festivals, concerts, and use the drugs in less safe situations. Or often, because they're illegal, they're not going to actually know what they're taking. They might think it's one thing and it's actually something else. Also, because of the lack of education, drug abuse resistance education, the DARE program taught people to just say no to drugs. It didn't teach people to ask what's in the drugs. It didn't teach people to monitor their dosage and not take too much. It just told people to say no. So once you say yes, what do you do? We just don't have the education for that. And so our harm reduction program.
It sounds a little bit like abstinence education. Just say no, and then if you decide to say yes, what's next? It reminds me a lot about that.
Exactly the same. Yeah, totally. What do you do? Once you've already gone against what your parents and your teachers have said, what do you do? And it turns out that people do this. Young people do this. And the war on drugs has been happening for 40 years, and drug use has only gone up. So the harm reduction program that we have, there's both a public education aspect of it, where we tell people, make sure you know what's in your drugs. If you don't, be careful of your dosage. And then the on-the-ground community aspect of it is we actually send volunteers to events like Burning Man, which is an annual art community event that takes place in the northern Nevada desert. Extremely harsh climate. Nothing lives there except for human beings once a year, and it's a harsh desert climate where it's easy to get dehydrated. It can get very, very hot or very, very cold in just a matter of hours. People often choose to use psychedelics and other drugs out there. Unfortunately, alcohol is the biggest problem out there, due to the issues with dehydration, and violent behavior and so on. But a lot of people also get in either psychological or physical trouble for their use of psychedelics. They've either taken too much, or they've gotten separated from their friends, or they've very often just forgotten to bring a water bottle with them because they're so excited and caught up in whatever they're doing. So we go to these festivals, just like we were at Burning Man this last year, and provide what's called the Zendo Project. That's our name for our harm reduction program, and that's where we set up a space, an actual physical space, in a Zen-style meditation yurt. We had 2 this year at Burning Man, and we worked closely with the on-site security and medical personnel there at Burning Man, to make sure that people knew about the project, and that if somebody's friend or you yourself were having a difficult experience, you could find the Zendo Project and come in. And once you got there, there's a team of volunteers, some of which are actual medical professionals, with a basic level of training in compassionate community-based peer-to-peer counseling, where you just come in and somebody will sit with you for the duration of the drug experience and provide a calm space to rest that's safe. It's enclosed. You can get water, electrolytes. And just by providing that space, it means that there's somewhere where there are trained volunteers available to take care of people who are having difficult psychedelic experiences, so that they don't need to get hospitalized and tranquilized, and they don't need to be arrested and thrown in jail. And simply by providing that additional option, we hope to divert some of those people and to help reduce some of the harms that are associated with people choosing to use those drugs.
So how did it go this year?
This year was a really monumental year, in the sense that it's the first year we've worked closely with the actual Burning Man organization to get the word out about the services. Still, in the U.S. and around the world, there's a lot of resistance on the part of event producers and organizers to providing harm reduction services, because it, in a way, acknowledges that drug use is happening at their events, and that's something that that many venues have wanted to push under the table for a long time, because they could potentially, or the idea is that they could potentially be prosecuted for facilitating drug use. The idea that by providing water to people at a concert, you're acknowledging that people are using drugs, which is the most backwards, unethical position you can take, and it's just totally counter to public health. But unfortunately, because of the war on drugs, that's how it's played out for a long time. So this year, we were able to work closely with the organization, entailing a recognition that the drug use is happening, and an honest, sincere desire on the part of the event producers to help the people who attend their events stay as safe as possible. So that was really exciting. We helped 161 people. We had 161 guests come in, and we had over 170 volunteers who donated over 1,700 hours of their time to just sit with people and set up the space and provide an alternative to law enforcement and arrest. And Burning Man isn't the only place that we go. We also go to smaller festivals and events. We're about done for this festival season, but definitely keep an eye out for us next year as we try to expand those services even further.
So just before we end, I want to ask you a bit more of a hypothetical, speculative question. In a world where marijuana use is legalized or at least decriminalized, where psychedelics perhaps are decriminalized or legalized, what does harm reduction look like kind of writ large? Because we are not very good at harm reduction for the things that are illegal, like sex, like alcohol. So what is the potential strategy for that kind of large scale harm reduction? Because these things do come with risks. And if they're available at a dispensary, if you can buy them, if or at the very least you don't have to hide their use, what does that strategy look like when it's not sort of you guys going to festivals because that's where the high usage is, and those are the groups that are willing to acknowledge that this stuff happens?
Oh, the harm at that point, when the drugs are legal and there's actual regulatory mechanisms in place to make sure that the drugs are pure, that people know what they're getting, that you have to be a certain age to get them, that they're stored and transported in a safe and secure way. Once we get to that point, the public education and harm reduction component of our work becomes much easier, because then, much like the DARE program, we can actually model that, and we can take that message to schools. We can take that to universities. We can put it on billboards. We can have television stations about harm reduction. It's like, hey, this is part of our culture. This is part of our society. Psychedelics are part of our society. Given that they are, here's how we can stay as safe as possible. One idea that I've heard circulated is comparing it to driver's licenses. Cars are exceptionally dangerous. People die every minute in cars. It's one of the greatest killers in the country is car accidents. And yet we give people licenses to drive. We have training courses for people to drive. We revoke licenses if somebody demonstrates that they're an irresponsible driver or they cause damage to themselves or another person or to property. So much like cars, we could actually give people tests and say, hey, here's your license to purchase psychedelics, or even to purchase alcohol. It would be a great idea to have this kind of education for alcohol as well. It's like, hey, congratulations, you're 21. In order to purchase alcohol, you need an ID that says that you've participated in a training course telling you what the dangers are, what the difference is between whiskey and beer and wine, and how much you can drink and when you shouldn't, and so on. So I think that kind of training, that kind of institutionalized public training and education becomes even easier once the drugs are legal. We don't have to hide it. We don't need to convince festival producers that it's okay. We don't need to help people feel more comfortable with it because it's already part of our culture. So we're looking forward to that for sure.
Brad, thanks so much for joining me today. It's a really fascinating, hugely exciting area of research that's going on right now. And for anybody who's listening who's interested in learning more about this, where do you suggest they go for either the best sorts of coverage, the non-exaggerated but still really interesting coverage of what's going on in psychedelics research?
It's been great speaking with you today, Rochelle. Love the program, and it's a real pleasure and an honor to get honest education about science out to people. It's one of my personal pleasures as well as my job. So thank you very much for the opportunity. For people to learn more about what we're doing, check out maps.org, maps.org. We're also on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Google Plus and YouTube, all over the social media world. That's a great place to just stay tuned to what's happening. We have an email newsletter at maps.org that you can sign up for. And I always invite people to write questions to me directly. I love to answer questions at brad@maps.org.
One more quick question. A lot of festivals that get organized are like small independent things. Maybe they're in a small town. They've got a few thousand people who show up. Do you guys have any information available for those kinds of smaller festivals about what types of harm reduction steps they can take or who they can contact to get more information about having a group like the Zendo Project at their festival, or creating a more localized group that can provide those types of services?
Yeah, absolutely. They can write to us at zendo@maps.org.
Thank you so much for joining us, Brad. It's you're great to talk to, and MAPS is really cool.
Thanks, Rochelle. You're great too. Thank you.
If you want to learn more about Brad Burge or the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, we've got the links to get you started in the show notes for this episode, which you can find on our website, which of course is scienceforthepeople.ca. On our website, you can find many more links, including links to all of our past episodes, links to our Facebook page and our Twitter feed, links to subscribe to the show on iTunes or the podcast app of your choosing, and also links to our Patreon page, where you can help support the show and keep us advertising free in exchange for additional extra content. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Science for the People.
Science for the People is recorded in Edmonton, Alberta. The show is produced by Rochelle Saunders. Ryan Bromsgrove is our promotions manager. Our social media manager is Chelsea Butler. K.O. Myers updates our website. Helen Quivalon is our publishing liaison. Ed Haynes is our guest coordinator. We get research help from Josh Witten. The show is edited by K.O. Myers and Ryan Bromsgrove. Our theme song was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern, and its title is Binary Consequence. The show is hosted by Rochelle Saunders, Marie Claire Shanahan, and me, Desiree Schell.